We're going to now talk about how to write a business case. You've put together all the pieces. Now it's time to assemble those into a coherent document that you can then present to the senior management team and other interested stakeholders on what your business case is. And remember, your business case is something that you want to make sure that sells your idea, that presents your idea in the best light, and so that it has the best chance of being objectively reviewed and then accepted, assuming it's consistent with the overall strategy of the organization. Now, if you recall from the anatomy of a business case, there are several very important sections. So if you recall from the anatomy of a business case lecture that we had a couple of modules ago, there are 7 key sections of the business case. The first being the executive summary. The business context is the second one. Third comes the analysis of alternatives. The fourth section is the financial analysis. The fifth section is risk analysis. And then the sixth section is the timeline. And then the seventh section, one that we haven't talked about a whole lot, is the appendix. And we'll go through each one of these 7 sections in turn. Your business case needs to be compelling, which means that it needs to align with the strategic direction of the organization. It needs to be thorough, that you've considered all the various options and considerations in your business case. It needs to be consistent. No one section should contradict something that you've said in another section, and it needs to be attractive. It not only needs to look good, but it needs to be easy to read, easy to understand, and easy to follow. All 4 of these items are important if you want your business case to get the due that it deserves. The first section of your business case is the executive summary, and it's probably the most important section of your entire business case. And as with all executive summaries, even though it comes first, you write it last. And your executive summary may be the only section that the senior manager of your organization, the key decision maker, may read. So you got to make it count. If you do a good enough job with your executive summary, they may in fact be encouraged to read the rest of your business case. However, if you don't do a very good job with your executive summary, you're likely not to get not only a fair hearing, but all the good things that might be in your business case and all the hard work you put into it may be for naught, because it never gets exposure and it never gets seen. It's important, though, that to start out with a very key sentence, and that is, this strategic initiative will, and then go on to explain what your strategic initiative will do. And then the next, probably most important sentence, and maybe even the next sentence, is state clearly what your return on investment is. One thing that every decision maker is going to look for early on in the executive summary is that return on investment. Even though it might be unfair, the fact is that the return on investment is how each project will be evaluated, and if you don't have a positive ROI, or if you don't have an ROI that meets the hurdle rate for the organization, the decision maker is going to stop reading, and so you don't want to waste their time. You want to make sure that your ROI is front and center. You have to understand that those who read your executive summary are busy individuals. You got to make sure that you clearly and concisely talk about the key things that are on their mind. And there is that list of questions. The first is, what is this new strategic initiative? And here you need to describe it in terms of the problem solved or the opportunity that you intend to seize. Then, how do you intend to seize that opportunity or solve that problem? What are the key features and functions of your strategic initiative? Then, who will benefit? What customer sets will actually see the benefit, or what users will see the benefit of your strategic initiative? Then what are the benefits to the organization in terms of reduced cost or increased revenue, or any other of the benefits that might be derived from your strategic initiative? And then what is the return on investment? Again, make that prominent and early in your executive summary. When will this initiative be available? When will it complete? When will it go to market? Those are going to be a key important question for you to answer. And then what are the risks And not only what are the risks, but what are you going to do about them? And your executive summary needs to be thorough, it needs to be concise, it needs to be well written and well formatted. And use simple language. Sentences that are in the approximate length of 6 to 10 words are good for an executive summary. It makes understanding and capturing the information easier. If you use long, complex, and complicated sentences, the decision maker, again, who has limited time and limited interest and a lot of these things to go through, isn't going to actually spend the time on your business case that perhaps you would like. So make sure that you're thorough, concise, you write it well, and it looks good so that you draw the senior decision maker into your business case. So the next section is the business context. And here you want to make sure that you answer two key questions. The first is, why is this the right strategic initiative? And secondly, why is now the right time? Here you want to make sure that you demonstrate that you have a compelling business case that is in fact supported by the facts and a logical analysis of the situation. Here's where we take all that we learned about the ICT environment in the first half of the course and apply that to this business context to create that compelling case that it convinces that this is the right project and now is the right time to invest. Here, though, you got to make sure that this section, well written, well researched, use graphs, tables, and charts to explain what you're trying to communicate. And again, make sure that it's well formatted. Section headings and subheadings work really well in this particular section because it allows for the reader to quickly understand what you're trying to communicate. The next section is the analysis of alternatives. And here what you want to do is describe each alternative and the various pros and cons. And what you want to do here is explain thoroughly what alternatives you considered and why did you choose the option that you did. And before you go into the details of each option and its description and pros and cons, provide an overview of the alternatives and why you chose the alternatives that you did in terms of further analysis. And what you want to do is, after you describe each alternative and the pros and cons, develop a table which explains the net present value, ROI, and payback of each option. And you also want to clearly articulate the assumptions associated with each option as well. And make sure that you use descriptive names here, not simply option 1, 2, and 3. And then you want to close this section with your choice and why you made the choice that you did. You also here want to make sure that this section is well written, that the choices and the alternatives that you presented are supported by the research. You want to make sure your assumptions are clear and your explanations are logical, and that you came to the choice that you did through clear and logical analysis of the facts associated with each one of your alternatives. The next section is the financial analysis, and this is the heart of the business case. We've spent a lot of time doing financial analysis. Probably next to the executive summary, this section is probably the most important. And this section is also the one that's going to get a fair amount of scrutiny, perhaps not by the decision maker, but by whomever the decision maker hands the business case off to make sure that the business case will in fact provide the value that you intended. So what you want to do here is you want to begin with what are your conclusions. So it's almost a mini executive summary of your financial analysis embedded into this financial analysis section. And you also want to describe your methodology, and you want to lead with your cash flow statement that articulates the benefits, the expenses, the investment in assets, and summarizes your cash flow. Then you want to go into a fairly detailed description of your benefits. And here you want to describe how did you arrive at the benefits that you are promising in your business case. And again, what are your assumptions associated with your benefits. Here you want to actually not only provide a narrative, but lay out the calculations so that they can be reviewed and scrutinized to ensure that, in fact, they make sense. The next section in your financial analysis is your cost budget. And here what you want to do is describe how did you arrive at your costs and what are the underlying assumptions. And you want to lay out your budget in detail, and you also want to describe your assumptions, particularly where you actually have to make some calculations in order to come up with certain costs. You want to make sure that those are laid out in detail as well so that they can be scrutinized by whomever is going to be reviewing your financial analysis. The next section in your financial analysis is the sensitivity analysis. And even though we talked about this in context of risk, you really want to include this in your financial analysis section. And the reason why this is important and why it's in this section is that the numbers that you come up with for net present value, return on investment, and payback in the sensitivity analysis are the NPV, ROI, and payback that you want to report out to senior management. And those are the numbers that go into your executive summary. I cannot emphasize this enough, because this NPV, this ROI, and this payback that you've calculated here in the sensitivity analysis represents the full range of possible outcomes, and you do not want to pin yourself exclusively to the most likely case. That does not create the hedge that you need to do in the face of uncertainty. But one of the things that you want to describe in your narrative as it relates to the sensitivity analysis is how did you arrive at the probabilities, and give some sort of rationale of how you came up with the probabilities that you did. And then you also want to explain any assumptions that you included in your sensitivity analysis. What you want to do is describe your assumptions in terms of what changes did you make in your best case and worst case from your most likely case, which represents your base case. Here, what I want to point out is, even though in this particular example the best case probability is higher than the worst case, you don't want to do that. What you want to make sure is that you create yourself a hedge such that the worst case has a higher probability of the best case. As I've said before, bad things unfortunately are more likely to happen, or things are going to go wrong with a higher probability than things are going to go perfectly, which is what the best case represents. And what you want to do is you want to show your work with respect to the best case and worst case scenarios. Now, you may not want to put it here in this particular section. You may want to put this in your appendix, but you got to make sure that you show your work in order to demonstrate that you've done the sensitivity analysis appropriately. Throughout the financial analysis, you got to make sure you're thorough so that you've covered all the benefits and costs and all the things that make up your cash flow statement, particularly when it comes to costs, that you're detailed and you create a detailed line item budget. You got to make sure your assumptions are clear and well stated, and that they're all stated, and that your explanations are logical, that they in fact do make sense. The next section is risk analysis. In the risk analysis section, you want to articulate what your risks are and describe what you intend to do about them. You need to focus on your major risks. You don't want to necessarily include every risk, even though in your analysis that you might have done that. And you want to make sure that your mitigations are clear and convincing, and that you make sure your financial analysis reflects the costs of your mitigation strategy. This is a key point of where you need to make sure that you're consistent. Even though the risk analysis comes toward the end of your business case, you got to make sure that any of the actions that you intend to take to mitigate those risks are reflected in your cost budget and or the benefits, wherever it applies. The last major section is the timeline. And in this section, what you want to do is answer the question of how will the strategic initiative get done at a high level. This is not a detailed project plan, but what you want to do is lay out key milestones, key deliverables in the road to developing your strategic initiative. And then what you want to actually do is communicate when can the organization begin to expect the promised value that your strategic initiative will do. And that's the whole point of the timeline. You got to make sure that your timeline is in fact high level and that it is in fact consistent with your planning horizon. So again, consistency comes into play here. Even though that the timeline comes later in the actual business case, the timeline is reflected throughout your business case, particularly in your financial analysis. The last section is an appendix, and here you want to include any supporting documentation, price lists from vendors, research studies if you did those to come up with what adoption rates might be, those sorts of things that someone may not read, but that in fact someone could refer to if in fact they're interested. You want to actually have the sensitivity analysis details as I've described before. You want to show the work of each of the cases that you use to determine your sensitivity analysis. And you want to put your FMEA analysis, that big spreadsheet, that would go in the appendix. Again, you wouldn't put that in the main body of the report. And then, of course, your references in your bibliography. The business case, again, is something that goes to senior management and is part of the overall development process. Your business case has to be compelling from the standpoint of that it's a problem that needs to be solved or an opportunity that needs to be seized that is consistent with the overall strategic direction of the organization and that it will in fact move the organization forward. It has to be thorough, that it contains all the details and all the facts and all the arguments that you need to lay out so that a proper decision can be made. It needs to be consistent throughout, and we talked about that when we went through each section, that no section should be inconsistent with the other ones, that you make sure that even though certain sections come later in the actual business case, that those activities that are described there are representative throughout the business case. And it needs to be attractive. Again, well written, well formatted, well laid out. You need something that is easy to read and easy to follow, because again, the people that are going to read this have a limited amount of time, and you don't want to have them work through a document that is difficult to follow and difficult to use. So there is an overall description of how to put together a business case